Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Playing with Power MTG, where we play with the most powerful cards in the most powerful formats. Tonight's game is brought to you by TCGplayer.com, where you can find all of your cards online while still supporting local game stores. Dragon Shield for all the best accessories to protect your decks, and through Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. Also be sure to check out our merchandise store. All purchases help grow the channel. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Nick, piloting the 4-color pairing of Tymna the Weaver and Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. This deck, called Opus Thief, is a disruptive deck, using wheels and cards that form soft combos with wheels. Nick's opening hand contains a Ponder, Limdual's Vault, Delay, Dark Confidant, Reflecting Pool, Underground River, and a Talisman of Dominance. Next, we have Josh piloting Derevi, Imperial Tactician. This deck, called Derevi Stacks, is also a disruptive deck, using Derevi's abilities coupled with Stacks pieces to assemble mana denial lots. Josh's opening hand contains an Arbor Elf, Eladamri's Call, Sol Ring, Flusterstorm, Yavimaya Coast, Lavinia, Keeper of Silence, and Verdant Catacombs. After that, we have ZACK piloting the 4-color pairing of Thrasios Triton Hero and Vial Smasher the Fierce. This deck, called Curious Control, is a disruptive deck as well, looking to put out value pieces, control the board, and grind the game. ZACK's opening hand contains an Azra Oddsmaker, Forbidden Orchard, Steam Vents, Ponder, Forest, Narset's Reversal, and his London Mulligan is a Brainstorm. Finally, we have Jonathan piloting the Gitrog monster. This deck, called Gitrog Dredge, is a proactive deck, seeking to combo off with the synergy of its commander and Dakmor Salvage. Jonathan's opening hand contains a Nullrod, City of Brass, Ancient Tomb, Force of Vigor, Phyrexian Tower, Sol Ring, and a City of Traders. Without further ado, let's kick off this grotesque group of gratuitous gameplay. Nick wins the hoverboard challenge and gets to start us off. Nick draws and then plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps his City of Brass to cast Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. Nick passes. Josh draws and then plays a Verdant Catacombs for turn. He cracks it for a Savannah. He casts an Arbor Elf and ends his turn. ZACK draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He also casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, likes what he sees, rearranges, and draws. ZACK ends his turn. Jonathan draws and plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps the City of Brass to cast a Sol Ring. He taps his Sol Ring to cast a Nullrod. Nullrod resolves and Jonathan passes. Nick draws and then plays a Reflecting Pool for turn. He taps his City of Brass to cast Dark Confidant. Nick ends his turn. Josh draws and plays a Marsh Flats for turn. He cracks it for a Tundra. He casts his commander, Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Derevi enters and Josh untaps his Arbor Elf. He attacks ZACK with his Arbor Elf. ZACK takes the hit, Derevi triggers, and Josh untaps his Tundra. All through, Josh passes. ZACK draws and plays a Mana Confluence for turn. ZACK passes. Jonathan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He taps his City of Brass and Ancient Tomb to cast Green Sun Zenith where X equals 2. He fetches up a Priest of Titania onto the battlefield and shuffles Green Sun back into his library. Jonathan passes. During his upkeep, Nick reveals a Windswept Heath off of its Dark Confidant. He draws for turn and then plays a Flooded Strand. He attacks ZACK with his Dark Confidant. Nick passes. Josh draws for turn and starts off by attacking Jonathan with Derevi and Nick with his Arbor Elf. In response, ZACK casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Derevi. Derevi is destroyed and Nick takes the hit off of Arbor Elf. In his second main phase, Josh plays a Yavimaya Coast for turn. Josh ships the turn to ZACK. ZACK draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. ZACK passes. Jonathan draws and then plays a Phyrexian Tower for turn. He taps his City of Brass to cast his commander, the Gitrog monster. All finished up, Jonathan passes. At the end of Jonathan's turn, Nick cracks his Flooded Strand for a Hallowed Fountain into play tapped. Also in the end step, Nick taps his City of Brass to cast Limdual's Vault. In response, Josh casts Eladamri's Call. In response, ZACK casts Flusterstorm, targeting Eladamri's Call with all 3 copies and Limdual's Vault with 1. In response, Nick pays 2 life and casts Mental Misstep, targeting the copy of Flusterstorm that's targeting his own spell. In response, Josh taps his Yavimaya Coast to cast a Flusterstorm of his own, with the copies of Flusterstorm targeting the original copies of Flusterstorm, 2 copies at Nick's Limdual's Vault, and 1 more at Nick's Mental Misstep. With that, the Fluster Storm all resolves on the stack, countering their appropriate targets, and Eladamri's Call resolves. Josh fetches up a Grand Arbiter Augustine IV into his hand. During his upkeep, Nick reveals a Yawgmoth's Will from his Dark Confidant. He draws and plays a Windswept Heath for turn. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts a Winds of Change. Everyone shuffles their hands into their library and draws that many cards. He attacks ZACK with a spirit he got from ZACK earlier. This is when he remembers that those spirits don't fly, and ZACK blocks with his Thrasios. All through, Nick passes. Josh draws and plays a Bountiful Promenade for turn. He casts Grand Arbiter Augustine IV. In response, Nick cracks his Windswept Teeth for a Sacred Foundry into play untapped, paying 2 life. Nick then taps his City of Brass to cast Delay, targeting Grand Arbiter. The spell is countered and exiled with 3 time counters on it. Josh attacks Nick with his Arbor Elf and passes the turn to ZACK. ZACK draws and plays a Command Tower for turn. He passes. During his upkeep, Jonathan sacrifices Ancient Tomb to Gitrog. He draws off the Gitrog and then draws for turn. He plays a Cavern of Souls for turn, naming Imp. He taps his City of Brass to cast Thoughtseize, targeting ZACK. Nick's Mystic Remora triggers and he draws a card. Thoughtseize resolves and ZACK reveals his hand. Jonathan makes ZACK discard Demonic Consultation, and then Jonathan loses 2 life through Thoughtseize. Next, Jonathan casts Summoner's Pact. Nick's Remora triggers and he draws a card. Jonathan goes to fetch up Putrid Imp, but then the table reminds him that Summoner's Pact can only find green creatures. In a tight situation, Jonathan instead fetches up a Wall of Roots in order to be able to pay for his pack trigger next turn. He casts a Wall of Roots. He then attacks Nick with his Gitrog. Nick blocks with Dark Confidant. All finished up, Jonathan passes. During his upkeep, Nick pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws for turn and plays an Underground River. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Josh removes a time counter from his Grand Arbiter. He draws for turn and plays a Forest. He casts a Bloom Tender. He ships the turn to ZACK. At the end of Josh's turn, ZACK taps his Mana Confluence and Forbidden Orchard for mana, giving a Spirit to Jonathan, and activates Thrasios, scrying and revealing a mountain. ZACK draws for turn and casts a Birds of Paradise. ZACK passes. During his upkeep, Jonathan pays for his pack trigger. Also in his upkeep, he sacks Cavern of Souls to Gitrog. He draws for turn and then taps his City of Brass to cast Ramanop Excavator. He plays a Marsh Flats for turn. He cracks his Marsh Flats, triggering Gitrog and drawing a card. He fetches up a Swamp onto the battlefield. He plays a Windswept Heath for turn. He cracks it, triggering Gitrog, and fetches up an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He attacks Nick with Gitrog. Nick takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Jonathan casts a Demonic Tutor. Nick's Mystic Remora triggers, and he draws a card. Jonathan fetches up a card into his hand, and then passes the turn. During his upkeep, Nick lets his Mystic Remora die. He draws for turn, and in his first main phase, he casts Gilded Drake. Drake resolves, and he exchanges it for Gitrog Monster. Nick then taps his City of Brass to cast Dark Deal. Everyone discards their hand and draws 1 less. Nick then plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He casts a Burning Inquiry. Everyone draws 3 and discards 3 at random. He plays a Morphic Pool as his Gitrog land for turn. He casts a Preordain, scrying 2, and drawing a card. Nick passes. At the end of Nick's turn, Josh activates Derevi from the command zone, putting it onto the battlefield and targeting one of ZACK's lands. In response, ZACK taps his Confluence and Forbidden Orchard, giving Jonathan another 1/1 Spirit, and activates Thrasios, scrying and revealing an Arcane Signet. During his upkeep, Josh removes a time counter from his Grand Arbiter. He draws and plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts a Feyburrow Elder. He casts a Collector Oof. He moves to combat and attacks ZACK with Derevi. ZACK blocks with his Birds of Paradise. All through, Josh passes. ZACK draws for turn and starts off by casting Toxic Deluge, paying 7 life and wiping the board. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast Sig, River Cutthroat. ZACK passes. Jonathan draws and plays a Forest for turn. He then taps his City of Brass to cast Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Jonathan reveals a Carpet of Flowers, Petrified Field, Squandered Resources, Misty Rainforest, Ebony Charm, Rift Sweeper, Lotus Petal, Polluted Delta, Grafdigger's Cage, Exploration, Cabal Pit, Noxious Revival, and a Cabal Ritual, deciding to stop there. All through, Jonathan passes. At the end of Jonathan's turn, ZACK's Sig triggers and he draws a card. Then Jonathan discards the hand size. Nick draws for turn and starts off by casting Mnemonic Betrayal. Looking at the graveyards and seeing what's about to happen, Jonathan responds by paying 2 life and casting Noxious Revival, targeting ZACK's Demonic Consultation, putting it onto the top of his library. With nothing else, Mnemonic Betrayal resolves, exiling all of his opponent's graveyard. Nick casts Jonathan's Dark Ritual. Nick then casts ZACK's Tainted Pact. He exiles cards from his library until he hits a Laboratory Maniac and stops there. Nick then casts ZACK's Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Nick then pays 2 life and casts Jonathan's Noxious Revival, targeting his Tarnished Citadel in his graveyard, putting it onto the top of his library. He then casts Zack's Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He casts Dark Ritual. He casts Jonathan's Demonic Tutor. He casts Thoughtseize, targeting Zack. Zack reveals his hand, Nick makes him discard Dig Through Time, and then Nick loses 2 life. Nick plays a Sea of Clouds for turn. He casts Zack's Ponder. He looks at the top 3, doesn't like what he sees, partly because he knew it was there from Brainstorm, and then shuffles and draws. He taps his City of Brass to cast Jonathan's Carpet of Flowers. He moves to his second main phase and adds red from his Carpet of Flowers. He casts Zack's Red Elemental Blast, targeting Zack's Sig River Cutthroat. He casts Jonathan's Lotus Petal. All through, Nick moves to his end step, and all graveyards return. Also in the end step, Josh activates Derevi from the command zone, putting it onto the battlefield. During his upkeep, Josh removes the final time counter from Grand Arbiter and casts it. He draws and plays a Breeding Pool, into play tapped. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Derevi. All through, Josh passes. Zack untaps, draws for turn, and passes. Jonathan draws and plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He cracks it for a swamp. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black to his pool. He casts Gitrog for the second time. He plays a Misty Rainforest as his Gitrog land for turn. He cracks his Misty Rainforest, triggering Gitrog, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. Finished up, Jonathan passes. Nick draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 2 black from his carpet. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He casts Heuristic Study. He passes the turn. Josh draws for turn and moves to combat, attacking Nick with Derevi and Grand Arbiter. Nick blocks Grand Arbiter with Kraum. In his second main phase, he casts Mana Vault. Josh ends his turn. Zack draws for turn and then casts his commander, Thrasios, for the second time. Zack passes. During his upkeep, Jonathan sacks a swamp to Gitrog. He draws for turn and then moves to combat. He attacks Nick with Gitrog and a 1/1 Spirit. After attacks are declared, Jonathan casts Ebony Charm, giving Gitrog Fear and paying for Heuristic Study. Nick takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Jonathan casts Squandered Resources. In response, Zack casts Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, and Zack names Pact of Negation. He exiles the top 6, and then exiles his library until he finds Pact of Negation. He casts Pact of Negation, countering Squandered Resources. Next, Jonathan casts Entomb. He fetches up a Dakmor salvage into his graveyard, triggering Gitrog and dredging Dakmor back to his hand. He casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing City of Brass, triggering Gitrog and drawing a card. He fetches up a Lake of the Dead onto the battlefield. He sacrifices a Swamp to Lake of the Dead, triggering Gitrog. He sacrifices Overgrown Tomb to Lake of the Dead, triggering Gitrog, drawing a card, and adding 4 black. He then casts Putrid Imp. Putrid Imp resolves, and with that, Jonathan demonstrates the Dakmor loop. He discards Dakmor to Putrid Imp, triggering Gitrog to draw a card, but instead dredging Dakmor back to his hand, milling 2 cards. Whenever he mills Gaia's Blessing, he shuffles his graveyard back into his library. He continues to do this, stacking draw triggers whenever he mills a land through the dredge. He stacks enough triggers to then draw his deck. He casts Dark Ritual repeatedly through this loop, netting more and more black mana with each cast. He then uses his mana and this loop to repeatedly cast Ebony Charm, draining the table until they are dead. Ladies and gentlemen, what a great game. Congrats to Jonathan on his win through 3 disruptive decks at the table. The most valuable card goes to Mnemonic Betrayal. The value this card creates when it is cast allows for some explosive turns, and Nick would have won had it not been for the timely Noxious Revival from Jonathan. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.